My name is Steven Torres, and I'm an AI researcher with 9 years of experience at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Boston. I specialize in algorithmic behavior analysis and machine learning systems. Essentially, I study how artificial intelligence influences human decision-making. For nearly a decade, I've been developing AI models for everything from recommendation systems to predictive analytics, always believing that technology would make society more efficient and fair. 4 months ago, I stumbled across something that fundamentally changed how I view the relationship between artificial intelligence and American democracy. What started as a routine analysis of algorithmic bias turned into the most disturbing discovery of my career. Evidence that AI systems across the United States are being coordinated to systematically modify American behavior on a scale that makes China's social credit system look primitive. And if you think this is just another tech paranoia story, trust me, you're wrong. Because what I discovered isn't happening in some distant authoritarian state. It's happening right here, right now, to every single person who uses a smartphone, social media, or any digital service in America. The discovery began with what should have been a straightforward research project. In September 2024, MIT received a grant to study algorithmic fairness in recommendation systems. My team was tasked with analyzing how different AI platforms, social media, shopping sites, news aggregators, might be inadvertently creating bias in the content they show users. We started by collecting data from major platforms: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Amazon, Google, and dozens of smaller services. Our methodology was simple. We created thousands of fake user profiles with different demographic characteristics and tracked what content each platform's algorithms chose to show them over several months. What we expected to find was confirmation of known biases, that algorithms might show different content to users based on race, gender, income, or political affiliation. What we actually found was something far more systematic and infinitely more disturbing. The algorithms weren't just biased, they were coordinated. Despite being developed by supposedly competing companies using different technical approaches, they were all implementing remarkably similar behavioral modification strategies. It was as if someone had given them all the same instruction manual. My hands literally trembled the first time I ran the correlation analysis. Across platforms, users with identical demographic profiles were being shown content designed to elicit specific emotional responses at precisely the same times. When Facebook's algorithm pushed anxiety-inducing news stories, TikTok simultaneously increased the frequency of stress-related content. When YouTube promoted certain political viewpoints, Instagram's recommendation system amplified complementary messaging. The timing wasn't random, it was orchestrated. As an AI researcher, I understand how machine learning systems work. Algorithms learn from user behavior, continuously adjusting their recommendations based on engagement metrics. But what I was seeing violated the fundamental principles of how these systems should operate. Independent algorithms developed by competing companies should not exhibit identical behavioral patterns unless they're being influenced by the same external factors. I spent weeks trying to rationalize what I was observing. Maybe it was convergent evolution. Perhaps all these companies had independently discovered the same optimal strategies for user engagement. Maybe there were shared training datasets or common industry practices that I wasn't aware of. But the more data I collected, the more impossible these explanations became. The coordination was too precise, too systematic, and too extensive to be coincidental. The breakthrough came when I started analyzing the timing of algorithmic changes across platforms. I discovered that major updates to recommendation algorithms were happening simultaneously across supposedly independent companies, not just within days or weeks of each other, but often within hours. On October 15th, 2024, I documented a particularly striking example. At approximately 2 a.m. Eastern Time, algorithms across Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram all simultaneously began prioritizing content related to economic anxiety and political polarization. Within 6 hours, millions of Americans were being fed carefully curated information designed to increase stress levels and social division. This wasn't market competition or natural algorithmic evolution. This was centralized coordination on a massive scale. Have you ever noticed how your social media feeds sometimes seem to be pushing the same themes across different platforms on the same day? How YouTube might recommend anxiety-inducing news videos right after Instagram shows you posts about economic uncertainty. Most people assume it's just the algorithms responding to current events, but what I discovered suggests something far more deliberate. The coordination wasn't limited to content recommendation. I found evidence of synchronized data sharing, coordinated user profiling, and what appeared to be centrally distributed behavioral modification protocols. These companies weren't just competing for user attention. They were collaborating to shape American society at the psychological level. But here's where things get really unsettling. When I tried to trace the source of this coordination, I kept running into the same problem. The data trails led to classified government contracts and private intelligence networks that I couldn't penetrate with my MIT research credentials. 3 weeks into my investigation, I made a connection that changed everything. While researching the timing patterns I discovered, I came across a seemingly unrelated news story about a Department of Homeland Security contract awarded to a private analytics firm called Predictive Insight Solutions. The contract was worth $400 million and was described in vague terms as advancing national security through behavioral prediction technologies. What caught my attention was the timeline. The contract was signed just 2 weeks before I detected the first synchronized algorithmic changes across social media platforms. I started digging deeper into Predictive Insight Solutions and discovered something extraordinary. The company had been quietly acquiring smaller AI firms for the past 3 years, building a portfolio of companies that specialized in behavioral modification, sentiment analysis, and social influence technologies. More importantly, they had existing contracts with every major social media platform in the United States. The pattern was becoming clear. Through a network of government contracts, private intelligence firms, and technology partnerships, someone was coordinating American social media algorithms to implement large-scale behavioral modification programs. But the most chilling discovery came when I analyzed the specific behavioral changes these coordinated algorithms were designed to promote. The system wasn't just collecting data about American citizens, it was actively reshaping how Americans think, feel, and behave. I identified several distinct behavioral modification programs running simultaneously across platforms. One program appeared designed to increase social isolation by promoting content that discouraged real-world social interaction. Another was systematically amplifying political polarization by showing users increasingly extreme versions of their existing beliefs. A third was promoting consumer behavior patterns that increased debt and financial dependence. Each program used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, carefully calibrated to produce specific behavioral changes without users recognizing they were being influenced. The system was essentially treating the entire American population as subjects in a massive, unauthorized psychological experiment. The evidence I gathered was overwhelming, but I needed to understand how extensive the coordination really was. I expanded my analysis to include financial services algorithms, e-commerce recommendation systems, and even navigation apps like Google Maps and Waze. What I found was a comprehensive digital control grid that touched virtually every aspect of American life. Credit scoring algorithms were coordinating with social media platforms to adjust individual credit ratings based on online behavior. E-commerce systems were manipulating pricing and product availability to influence purchasing decisions. Even navigation apps were subtly directing traffic patterns to benefit specific businesses or avoid areas where certain types of social gatherings might occur. The system was so pervasive that most Americans were having their daily decisions influenced by coordinated algorithms dozens of times per day, without any awareness it was happening. As I continued my research, I began to understand that what I discovered wasn't just an isolated surveillance program. It was part of a broader transformation of American society that had been in development for years. The coordination between government agencies, private intelligence firms, and technology companies represented a new form of social control that operated entirely through the digital systems Americans used voluntarily. The beauty of the system, from a control perspective, was that it didn't require any traditional authoritarian mechanisms. There were no secret police, no overt censorship, no obvious restrictions on freedom. Instead, The system worked by subtly influencing the information people received, the choices they were offered, and the emotional states they experienced while making decisions. Americans believed they were making free choices, but those choices were being systematically manipulated by algorithms designed to produce predetermined outcomes. I started looking at recent American social and political trends through the lens of what I discovered, and the patterns were undeniable. The increasing political polarization, the rise in social isolation, the growth of conspiracy theories, the decline in trust between communities. All of these trends corresponded perfectly with the behavioral modification programs I'd identified in the algorithmic systems. But perhaps most disturbing was realizing that this system was designed to be self-reinforcing. The more divided and isolated Americans became, the more they relied on digital platforms for information and social connection. The more they used digital platforms, the more data the system collected, and the more precisely it could manipulate their behavior. It was a perfect feedback loop that ensured its own expansion and permanence. The timing of recent events began to make more sense when viewed through this perspective. The synchronized promotion of economic anxiety content I detected in October 2024 coincided exactly with a period when Congress was debating increased funding for domestic surveillance programs. The amplification of political division corresponded with election periods when public attention was focused on partisan conflict rather than systemic issues. The system wasn't just passively monitoring American society. It was actively shaping public opinion and social behavior to serve specific political and economic objectives. I realized that what I was documenting represented the emergence of a new form of authoritarianism, one that operated not through force or obvious control, but through the systematic manipulation of information and choice architecture. Americans were living under a form of digital dictatorship that was so sophisticated most people didn't even recognize it existed. What struck me most about my discovery was how closely it resembled scenarios that had been depicted in popular culture for years. Shows like Black Mirror, movies like The Social Network, and documentaries like The Social Dilemma had been warning about exactly these kinds of digital control systems. But what had been presented as dystopian fiction was actually an accurate preview of current reality. The algorithms I was studying used the same psychological manipulation techniques portrayed in Charlie Brooker's Nosedive episode of Black Mirror, where social media ratings controlled access to services and opportunities. The coordinated information manipulation I discovered was remarkably similar to the scenarios depicted in The Great Hack documentary about Cambridge Analytica. It was as if entertainment media had been providing a form of cultural preparation for digital authoritarianism, gradually acclimatizing the American public to the idea that their digital lives could be systematically monitored and manipulated. But the reality was far more sophisticated than any fictional portrayal. The system I discovered didn't rely on obvious surveillance or transparent social scoring. Instead, it operated through the invisible manipulation of algorithmic systems that people used voluntarily and trusted implicitly. The timing was particularly significant. Many of these cultural warnings about digital manipulation had appeared in the mid to late 2010s, exactly when the infrastructure for large-scale algorithmic coordination was being developed and deployed. It was possible that entertainment industry insiders had been aware of these developments and had used fictional narratives to communicate warnings they couldn't express directly. I started paying closer attention to recent entertainment content and noticed that themes of digital surveillance, algorithmic manipulation, and social control had become increasingly prominent across movies, TV shows, and even video games. It was as if the entertainment industry was trying to educate the American public about threats to their freedom that couldn't be discussed through traditional media or academic channels. The question was whether this cultural messaging was an attempt to warn people about emerging digital control systems, or whether it was part of the control system itself, gradually normalizing the idea that comprehensive surveillance and behavior modification were inevitable aspects of modern life. What I discovered next made me realize that the distinction might not matter. The digital control system was so comprehensive that it could adapt to and incorporate any form of resistance or criticism, including entertainment that purported to warn against it. 6 weeks into my investigation, I started experiencing the kind of professional pressure that confirmed I was onto something significant. My research funding was suddenly under review by MIT administration. Conference presentations I had scheduled were canceled without explanation. Colleagues who had been eager to collaborate on my research became mysteriously unavailable. Most unsettling, my own social media feeds began showing content that seemed designed to discredit my research before I had even published it. Articles questioning the credibility of AI researchers, posts promoting skepticism about conspiracy theories in technology, and content suggesting that concerns about algorithmic manipulation were overblown paranoia. The system I was studying was apparently studying me back. I realized that my investigation had probably triggered automated monitoring systems that flagged me as someone conducting unauthorized research into sensitive topics. The algorithmic coordination I discovered included mechanisms for identifying and neutralizing threats to the system's operation. This wasn't paranoia. It was a logical feature of any sophisticated control system. The same behavioral modification algorithms that influenced ordinary American citizens could be deployed against researchers, journalists, or activists who posed challenges to the system's effectiveness. But rather than deterring my research, these responses convinced me that what I discovered was even more important than I had initially realized. The system wasn't just influencing American behavior, it was actively defending itself against exposure and criticism. I decided to document everything I had learned and find ways to share it publicly before the pressure to discontinue my research became impossible to resist. What follows is what every American needs to understand about the digital control system that now governs our society. The coordinated algorithmic system I discovered operates through several key mechanisms that most Americans encounter daily without recognizing their true purpose. Social media feeds are continuously adjusted to promote specific emotional states and behavioral patterns. Search results are manipulated to control what information people can easily access. E-commerce platforms coordinate with credit agencies to influence purchasing decisions and debt accumulation patterns. Navigation and location services subtly direct people towards certain areas and away from others, influencing everything from local business success to the likelihood of social encounters that might promote community organization. Even news aggregation systems are coordinated to ensure that Americans receive carefully curated information that supports predetermined political and social objectives. The system is designed to be invisible and to produce changes in behavior that feel like natural choices rather than external manipulation. Americans believe they are freely choosing what to read, what to buy, where to go, and how to think about social and political issues. But these choices are systematically influenced by algorithms designed to produce predictable outcomes. The most chilling aspect of the system is how it exploits American values of individual freedom and market choice to implement unprecedented social control. Americans resist obvious authoritarianism, but they embrace technologies that promise convenience, personalization, and efficiency. The digital control system delivers these benefits while simultaneously implementing comprehensive behavioral modification that would be impossible through traditional authoritarian methods. The long-term implications are staggering. If current trends continue, American society will become increasingly predictable and controllable, with individual behavior patterns shaped by algorithmic systems rather than personal choice or democratic deliberation. Social and political outcomes will be determined not by genuine public opinion or free market competition, but by the objectives programmed into coordinated AI systems. The system is already advanced enough that most major social trends in America, from political polarization to consumer behavior patterns to social isolation, are significantly influenced by algorithmic manipulation. As the system becomes more sophisticated and comprehensive, the gap between apparent freedom and actual control will continue to expand. But perhaps most concerning is that the system is designed to be self-improving and self-protecting. Machine learning algorithms continuously become more effective at influencing behavior, while automated monitoring systems identify and neutralize potential threats to the system's operation. Americans are living through the implementation of the most sophisticated social control system in human history, and most people don't even realize it's happening. The question isn't whether the system exists. The evidence I've documented proves that it does. The question is whether Americans will recognize what's happening and take action to preserve genuine freedom and democratic self-governance. or whether they'll continue to embrace technologies that systematically undermine the foundations of free society. What's particularly troubling is how the system has been implemented gradually, through the voluntary adoption of convenient technologies rather than through obvious coercion. Americans have willingly provided the data, attention, and behavioral patterns that make comprehensive algorithmic control possible. We've built the infrastructure of our own digital imprisonment and paid companies to operate it. The system I discovered represents the emergence of what historians may someday recognize as a new form of government, one that operates not through traditional political institutions, but through the coordination of private technology platforms that have become essential to daily life. It's a form of authoritarianism that's compatible with the appearance of democracy and free markets because it works by influencing choices rather than restricting them obviously. Have you ever noticed how your digital devices seem to understand your interests and preferences better than you do? How recommendations from various platforms often align in ways that feel almost psychic? How certain ideas or concerns seem to emerge simultaneously across different digital environments? What feels like technological intuition is actually evidence of the comprehensive behavioral profiling and coordinated influence system that now shapes American society. Your digital devices understand you because they're systematically studying and manipulating you, using insights from that analysis to influence your future thoughts and decisions. The scariest part isn't that the system exists, it's how normal it has become. Americans have adapted to living under comprehensive digital surveillance and behavioral manipulation so gradually that most people consider it a natural feature of modern life rather than a fundamental threat to human freedom. But understanding how the system works is the first step toward reclaiming agency over our own minds and choices. The algorithms are sophisticated, but they're not omnipotent. They rely on data collection, behavioral predictability, and our unconscious compliance with their influence. I started taking practical steps to reduce my exposure to coordinated algorithmic manipulation, and I was amazed by how different my life became when I wasn't constantly being influenced by systems designed to shape my behavior. My thinking became clearer, my emotions more stable, and my choices more genuinely my own. But individual resistance isn't enough. The system I discovered represents a collective threat that requires collective solutions. Americans need to understand what's happening to our society and demand transparency, accountability, and democratic control over the algorithmic systems that now govern so much of our lives. The technology itself isn't evil. AI and algorithmic systems could be incredible tools for improving human life and expanding genuine freedom. But they need to be developed and deployed in ways that serve human flourishing rather than systematic control. That requires public awareness, political action, and a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between technology and democracy. The choice we face isn't between technology and freedom. It's between algorithmic systems that serve human agency and algorithmic systems that undermine it. We still have time to choose, but that window is closing as the digital control system becomes more entrenched and comprehensive. What do you think about these discoveries? Have you noticed patterns in your own digital experiences that might reflect algorithmic coordination? More importantly, what are you willing to do to preserve genuine freedom and democratic self-governance in an age of artificial intelligence? I'm curious about your own observations and experiences. Sometimes the most important insights come from people outside academic institutions who are willing to look critically at the digital systems that surround us. The system I discovered is sophisticated, but it's not invisible to people who know what to look for. And if you work in technology, research, or journalism, I'd encourage you to investigate these issues yourself. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look, but it requires people with the technical skills and institutional resources to conduct serious analysis. We need more researchers documenting how these systems work and more journalists willing to report on their implications for American democracy. The future of human freedom may depend on whether enough people wake up to what's happening before the digital control system becomes too entrenched to challenge. We're living through a pivotal moment in human history, and the choices we make now will determine whether technology becomes a tool for liberation or control.